The sanctuary had never felt this silent. Not because the service had begun, not because the congregation was praying, but because something had gone terribly wrong. More than 400 people filled the old wooden church in Memphis that humid Sunday evening. Families squeezed into every pew. Elderly couples clutched worn Bibles against their chests. Young children whispered to each other before their mothers gently reminded them to be quiet. Everyone had come for one reason: the annual gospel homecoming. For nearly 30 years, it had been the most anticipated worship service in the county. Choirs traveled from neighboring towns. Ministers exchanged pulpits. Donations collected that evening funded food for struggling families, paid medical bills for elderly church members, and helped repair homes damaged during storms. But this year's service carried even greater meaning. It would be the final public performance of Isaiah Brooks. To most people, he was simply the choir's lead singer. To the church, he was its heartbeat. Whenever Isaiah sang, people forgot about the outside world. Farmers forgot their debts. Widows forgot their loneliness. Children forgot their hunger. For a few precious minutes, heaven felt closer than earth. That was why every seat had been taken nearly an hour before the service. Nobody wanted to miss Isaiah's final song. Behind the sanctuary, however, everything was falling apart. The choir room buzzed with nervous excitement. Women adjusted their burgundy robes. Men quietly warmed up their voices. The choir director, Margaret Ellis, smiled despite the pressure resting on her shoulders. 10 minutes, everyone! Isaiah stood near the mirror, carefully buttoning the collar of his robe. He looked older than usual. His hands trembled slightly. Margaret noticed. "You all right?" Isaiah forced a smile. "Just a little tired." "You've been saying that all week." "I'll be fine." He reached for a glass of water. Before his fingers touched it, his face suddenly twisted. The glass slipped from his hand. It shattered across the floor. Isaiah grabbed his chest. His knees buckled. Within seconds, he collapsed. For one horrifying moment, nobody moved. The room became frozen in disbelief. Then someone screamed, "Call an ambulance!" Choir members rushed toward him. Margaret dropped beside Isaiah, holding his head. "Isaiah, stay with me!" His breathing had become shallow. His eyes struggled to stay open. One of the deacons sprinted toward the telephone. Another church member ran outside searching for anyone with medical experience. The choir members began crying. Some prayed. Others simply stared. None of them knew what to do. Inside the sanctuary, the congregation waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. People exchanged confused glances. Children grew restless. Whispers spread from one pew to another. "What is happening? Is everything all right? Why hasn't the choir come out?" No announcement came, only silence. The kind of silence that slowly turns hope into fear. Margaret finally stepped into the hallway. Her face had lost all color. Pastor Samuel Harris immediately knew something was terribly wrong. "What happened?" She couldn't answer. Instead, she simply began crying. The pastor looked toward the choir room. Several men were surrounding Isaiah's motionless body. The ambulance sirens could already be heard in the distance. Pastor Harris quietly removed his glasses, closed his eyes, and whispered, "Lord." 20 minutes later, the ambulance doors slammed shut. Isaiah's wife climbed inside beside him. The vehicle disappeared into the night. No one knew whether he would survive. Back inside, the choir room felt empty. The robes that moments ago symbolized celebration now looked like mourning garments. Margaret stared at the floor. "We can't do this." Nobody argued. Everyone knew she was right. Without Isaiah, the choir had never performed. Not once. His voice wasn't merely part of the music, it was the foundation. Pastor Harris slowly walked toward the sanctuary. Every step felt heavier than the last. Hundreds of people looked at him as he reached the pulpit. He cleared his throat. His voice shook. "My brothers and sisters." The room became completely silent. "I have difficult news." Faces immediately changed. "Our dear brother Isaiah became seriously ill just moments ago." Gasps echoed across the church. "He has been taken to the hospital." Several women covered their mouths. One elderly man lowered his head and quietly began praying. Pastor Harris continued, "Tonight's service—" He stopped. The words refused to come. Margaret stood near the doorway. Tears streamed down her face. The choir behind her looked completely defeated. The pastor finally whispered, "May have to be canceled." The announcement landed like thunder. Months of preparation. Gone. People didn't complain. No one became angry. Instead, a deep sadness spread throughout the sanctuary. An elderly woman quietly sobbed. A young boy asked his mother, "Is Isaiah going to die?" His mother couldn't answer. She simply hugged him tighter. Near the front pew, a veteran removed his hat and bowed his head. Even the children sensed something sacred had just been interrupted. Several choir members removed their robes. One man quietly said, "I can't sing tonight." Another nodded, "Neither can I." Margaret didn't blame them. Neither could she. The church had lost more than a singer. It had lost its courage. Near the back of the sanctuary, far away from the attention, sat a man wearing a dark navy suit. His head remained lowered during the entire announcement. Most people hadn't recognized him. The lights were dim. He had arrived late. He had deliberately chosen the last pew. He wasn't there as a celebrity. He wasn't there for photographs. He wasn't even expected. He had simply wanted to worship quietly. The man slowly looked toward the empty choir loft. His eyes lingered on the vacant microphone standing alone beneath the wooden cross. Memories flooded back. Tiny country churches, his mother's gentle voice, long evenings singing hymns before anyone knew his name, before fame, before Hollywood, before screaming crowds, before the world called him Elvis Presley. He quietly closed his eyes, almost as if he were hearing those childhood hymns again. Then he stood. The movement caught almost no one's attention at first. He slowly walked down the center aisle, not confidently, not dramatically, almost hesitantly, as though every step carried a question. When he finally reached the front, Margaret looked up through tear-filled eyes. Pastor Harris turned toward him. The congregation slowly began whispering, "Is that? No! It can't be." Elvis removed his hands from his pockets. His voice was calm, soft, almost uncertain. "If," he paused, "if your choir has lost its voice tonight." Another silence filled the sanctuary. Then Elvis gently raised one hand. "Would you allow me to borrow your microphone?" The entire church stopped breathing. For several long seconds, no one answered. The sanctuary seemed frozen in time. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the man standing quietly beneath the cross. Some people still weren't sure they had heard him correctly. Others couldn't believe who they were looking at. The whispers slowly spread across the pews. "That's Elvis. Is it really him? Why would he be here? He wasn't on the program. He came alone." Margaret Ellis stared at him, speechless. She had expected sympathy, perhaps a few comforting words. But she had never imagined that one of the most recognizable voices in America would quietly offer to replace the choir's missing soloist. Not for money, not for publicity, simply because the church needed someone. Pastor Samuel Harris studied Elvis carefully. He had watched famous people before, politicians, businessmen, entertainers. Most carried themselves with an invisible expectation that the room should revolve around them. Elvis didn't. He looked almost uncomfortable standing there, as though he hoped someone else would volunteer instead. The pastor stepped closer. "Son," his voice remained gentle. "Do you know what you're asking?" Elvis nodded once. "I think I do. This isn't a concert." "I know. There won't be cameras. I didn't come for cameras. This church has buried families together, cried together, prayed together." "I understand." Pastor Harris looked directly into his eyes. "If you stand behind this pulpit, you won't be singing for applause." Elvis smiled softly. "I haven't been looking for applause tonight." The old pastor noticed something in that answer, something honest, something that reminded him of the shy teenager who used to stand near the back of country churches before the world discovered his name. Still, the decision wasn't his alone. Margaret slowly walked toward Elvis. Her hands trembled. "Mr. Presley, please," he interrupted kindly. "Just Elvis." She nodded. "Elvis. You know, Isaiah wasn't just our lead singer." "I know. He knew every harmony, every cue, every verse. The choir follows him." Elvis looked toward the empty choir loft. "I won't replace him." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" "I can't replace a man who gave this church his life. I can only stand where he's supposed to be, until he comes home." The words struck her harder than she expected. Several choir members lowered their heads. One young tenor quietly wiped tears from his eyes. Not everyone welcomed the idea. A deacon named Walter stepped forward. His face carried obvious concern. "Pastor, I don't think this is wise." Pastor Harris remained silent. Walter continued. "He's a wonderful singer. No one denies that. But people came here to worship. They'll spend the whole evening staring at Elvis Presley." Several church elders nodded. Another woman whispered, "Our choir isn't a stage show." One elderly gentleman folded his arms. "We've protected this ministry for decades. We shouldn't change that because a celebrity walked in." The room became tense again. Margaret looked from one face to another. She understood every concern. They weren't rejecting Elvis. They were protecting something sacred. Elvis himself finally spoke, quietly, without offense. "They're right." Everyone turned toward him. "If my being here distracts people from God, I'll walk back to my seat. I'd rather leave quietly than become the reason this service loses its purpose." No pride, no argument, no disappointment, just humility. The simplicity of his response filled the room with another kind of silence. Walter slowly looked away. He hadn't expected that answer. Pastor Harris walked toward the large wooden cross hanging above the choir loft. He stood beneath it for several moments. Then he turned back. "When David faced Goliath," he began softly, "no one expected a shepherd. when Moses spoke. No one expected a shepherd either. When the disciples followed Jesus, no one expected fishermen. He looked directly at the choir. Sometimes, God sends help from places we never planned. His eyes settled on Elvis. Tonight, I don't believe we're being asked to replace Isaiah. I believe we're being asked not to let fear silence our praise. No one spoke. The words settled into every heart. Margaret inhaled deeply. She looked toward the choir. Those willing to sing, "Stay. If anyone feels they cannot continue, there will be no judgment." One by one, several choir members remained standing, then another, then another. A young alto stepped forward. "I'll sing." A bass singer nodded. "So will I." An older woman wiped her eyes. "For Isaiah." Within a minute, nearly every robe remained in place, not because they felt ready, because they refused to let grief have the final word. Margaret turned back toward Elvis. "There's one more problem." He waited. "We don't know what song to sing." The choir's planned program had depended entirely on Isaiah's final solo. Without him, everything collapsed. Elvis looked toward the old piano resting beside the choir loft. Its wooden finish had faded with age. He slowly walked over. His fingertips gently brushed across the worn keys. Dust shimmered beneath the sanctuary lights. He smiled faintly. "My mother loved this hymn." Margaret asked quietly, "Which one?" Elvis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pressed a single note. The sound echoed softly through the empty church. Another note followed, then another. Several elderly members immediately recognized the melody. One woman covered her mouth. "No," she whispered, "it couldn't be." The pianist, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, slowly approached. She hadn't played that hymn publicly in nearly 15 years. Her aging fingers rested above the keys. She looked at Elvis. "Are you thinking?" He nodded. "If you're willing." Mrs. Carter smiled through tears. "I've been praying someone would ask." The choir gathered around the piano. No rehearsals, no arrangements, no sheet music, only memory. Some remembered the first verse, others remembered the chorus. One tenor quietly admitted, "I don't remember the ending." Elvis chuckled gently. "Neither do I." The room laughed. Not loudly, just enough to break the unbearable weight hanging over everyone's hearts. For the first time since Isaiah collapsed, hope returned. Small, fragile, but real. As the choir prepared, a young church volunteer hurried into the room. He was breathing heavily. "They're asking questions." Margaret frowned. "Who?" "The congregation. They want to know if the service has been canceled." Pastor Harris smiled softly. "No." He looked toward the choir. "Tell them," his voice steadied, "that worship is about to begin." Outside the choir room, hundreds of people remained seated in complete uncertainty. Children leaned against their parents. The elderly quietly prayed. Some expected everyone to leave. Others believed another announcement was coming. No one imagined what they were about to witness. Behind the closed wooden doors, Elvis adjusted the microphone stand. He closed his eyes, folded his hands, and whispered a prayer so quietly that only Margaret, standing beside him, could hear. "Lord, they didn't come to hear me. They came to find you. If my voice gets in the way, take it. But if one broken heart needs hope tonight, use every note. Margaret felt tears run freely down her cheeks. She realized something in that moment. The greatest voice in the room wasn't the one that was about to sing. It was the one that had just prayed. The sanctuary lights dimmed. Pastor Harris reached for the sanctuary doors. Slowly, they began to open. The congregation looked toward the choir loft. No one yet knew. The first note was about to change every life inside that church. The sanctuary doors opened. A hush swept through the church as the choir slowly walked back onto the platform. Their steps were slower than before. Their faces still carried traces of grief. Yet something had changed. The hopelessness that had nearly broken them only minutes earlier had been replaced by quiet determination. People in the congregation immediately noticed something unusual. The empty place where Isaiah always stood was no longer empty. Standing beside the old silver microphone was Elvis Presley, not dressed in a glittering stage suit, not smiling at the audience, not waving to admirers. His hands rested calmly in front of him. His head remained bowed. The whispers spread like wind through dry leaves. My goodness, it really is him. What is Elvis doing here? Is he going to perform? Some teenagers leaned forward with excitement. A few adults looked uncertain. Others folded their hands, silently wondering whether the evening was about to become a concert instead of a worship service. Pastor Samuel Harris stepped to the pulpit before anyone's imagination could run too far. My brothers and sisters, his voice echoed gently across the sanctuary. I ask only one thing tonight. He looked toward every corner of the room. Forget who is standing behind that microphone. Several people exchanged confused glances. Close your eyes if you need to. Do not listen for a famous voice. Listen only for the message. If tonight becomes about a man, we have failed. But if tonight reminds even one soul that hope still lives, then this service will become greater than any of us planned. The sanctuary grew completely still. Even those who had been whispering moments earlier lowered their heads. Elvis never looked up. He simply waited. Mrs. Evelyn Carter quietly took her seat at the piano. Her hands hovered above the worn ivory keys. She had accompanied this choir for over 40 years. She had played at weddings, at baptisms, at funerals. She had celebrated new life. She had mourned unimaginable loss. But she could not remember the last time her hands had trembled this much. She whispered to herself, "Help me remember." Elvis glanced toward her. Their eyes met for only a second. He smiled gently. She smiled back. Without another word, she played the first chord. It floated softly through the sanctuary, warm, simple, familiar. Another chord followed, then another. Several elderly women immediately recognized the hymn. One quietly placed her hand over her heart. An older gentleman sitting near the back suddenly smiled through tears. His wife whispered, "I haven't heard this song since Mama passed away." He squeezed her hand. "Neither have I." Elvis stepped closer to the microphone. He didn't grab it dramatically. He didn't clear his throat. He simply inhaled. Then, almost like a prayer, he began to sing. His voice was softer than anyone expected. It wasn't the powerful sound that filled arenas. It wasn't the playful confidence people heard in his rock and roll records. This voice carried something different. It sounded vulnerable, almost fragile. Every word seemed carefully placed, not performed, offered. The first verse drifted through the sanctuary like morning light entering an old stained glass window. People who had expected excitement instead found themselves overwhelmed by peace. Children stopped fidgeting. The restless whispers disappeared. Even the air inside the church seemed to grow still. Margaret watched from the choir loft. She couldn't stop staring. This wasn't the Elvis the world knew. She remembered watching television broadcasts years earlier, crowds screaming, flashing cameras, bright lights. This man looked nothing like that performer. He looked like a little boy singing beside his mother in church. She suddenly understood why his voice carried such honesty. Because he wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was remembering where he came from. The choir quietly joined him. Not loudly, not all at once. One alto entered first, then a tenor, then the basses. The harmonies slowly wrapped themselves around Elvis's voice until it no longer sounded like a solo. It sounded like one family singing together. Margaret felt goosebumps cover her arms. She looked toward the empty chair where Isaiah usually prepared himself before every service. For the first time since the ambulance left, the chair no longer felt empty. It felt honored, as though the choir was carrying his spirit forward. Halfway through the hymn, something unexpected happened. Near the front pew sat an elderly woman wearing a faded lavender suit and a flowered hat. Everyone in the church knew her as Miss Clara. She had buried her husband 12 years earlier. She had buried a son during the Korean War. She rarely smiled anymore. During every service, she sat quietly, barely speaking to anyone. As Elvis reached the chorus, Miss Clara suddenly began crying. Not softly, not politely. She wept with the kind of grief that had been hidden for years. The woman beside her reached for her hand. Miss Clara shook her head. "No," she whispered through tears. "I'm all right." Then she looked toward the ceiling. Her voice broke. "I finally remembered his voice." The woman beside her frowned. "My husband's. I forgot what he sounded like. But this song," she closed her eyes, "it brought him home for just a moment." Several people nearby began wiping away tears. Not because of Elvis, because everyone carried someone they missed. A father, a daughter, a brother, a friend. The hymn was quietly unlocking memories that grief had buried beneath the passing years. Across the aisle, a young man named Daniel sat with his wife. Neither had spoken much during the drive to church. Their marriage had been falling apart for months. Bills, arguments, long nights filled with silence. Daniel had packed a suitcase only 2 nights before. He had planned to leave after the weekend. His wife didn't know. As the choir sang, she slowly reached for his hand, not expecting anything, just hoping he wouldn't pull away. Daniel looked down at her trembling fingers. For several seconds, he didn't move. Then, without saying a word, he intertwined his fingers with hers. She quietly rested her head against his shoulder. Neither of them noticed tears running down their faces. For the first time in months, neither of them felt alone. Near the back of the sanctuary, a teenage boy named Michael sat with crossed arms. He had refused to sing, refused to pray, refused to believe. After losing his older brother in a car accident the previous year, he had become angry at everything, especially God. His mother had begged him to come to church that evening, only because Isaiah was singing. Now Isaiah wasn't even there. Michael stared toward the platform with obvious frustration. Then Elvis reached one particular line of the hymn, a line about broken hearts never being forgotten. Michael lowered his eyes. His jaw tightened. He tried not to cry. He failed. The tears came anyway. His mother quietly wrapped her arm around him. For the first time since the funeral, he didn't push her away. By the time the second verse ended, the atmosphere inside the sanctuary had completely changed. No one cared that Elvis Presley was standing at the microphone anymore. Some people had even forgotten he was there, because somehow the song had become everyone's story, everyone's prayer, everyone's memory. Pastor Harris looked across the congregation. He had preached thousands of sermons, yet he had rarely witnessed anything like this. No emotional speeches, no dramatic miracles, only one humble hymn, sung with complete sincerity. Sometimes that was enough. As the final chorus approached, Mrs. Evelyn Carter gently slowed her playing. The choir softened. The harmonies became almost a whisper. Elvis closed his eyes. He no longer saw the congregation. He no longer saw the lights. He no longer heard the whispers of recognition. He was somewhere else, back in a tiny wooden church, standing beside his mother, listening as she sang with absolute faith despite the hardships surrounding them. A single tear rolled down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. The congregation saw it, and suddenly many of them realized something they had never considered before. Fame could fill stadiums. Money could buy mansions. Success could make headlines. But none of those things could keep a man from needing God. That tear said more than any interview ever could. The piano faded into silence. The final note hung gently in the air. No one moved. No one clapped. No one dared disturb the sacred stillness. It felt as though heaven itself had paused inside that little church. Then, from somewhere near the back, a familiar voice quietly whispered, "Pastor." Everyone turned. A church usher stood frozen in the aisle, breathing hard after rushing in from outside. His eyes were wide with disbelief. He looked directly at Pastor Harris. "The hospital just called." "The hospital just called." The usher's voice trembled. Every face in the sanctuary turned toward him. The silence that followed felt heavier than the walls themselves. Pastor Harris slowly stepped down from the pulpit. What did they say? The young usher swallowed hard. They stabilized Isaiah. A collective breath escaped the congregation. But that single word tightened every heart once again. The doctors aren't sure he'll recover. They don't know if he'll ever sing again. The joy that had begun to bloom only moments before was suddenly mixed with uncertainty. Margaret lowered her head. Several choir members quietly embraced one another. Mrs. Evelyn Carter removed her glasses and wiped away fresh tears. Elvis remained standing beside the microphone. He didn't speak. He simply closed his eyes. Pastor Harris looked across the congregation. "My friends, tonight we received hope, but our brother still needs prayer." He stepped away from the pulpit. "I'm asking everyone who is able, come closer." Without hesitation, families began leaving their pews. Young children held their parents' hands. Elderly couples slowly walked down the aisle. The choir descended from the loft. Within minutes, nearly everyone stood together near the front of the sanctuary. There were no strangers anymore, only people united by one purpose: praying for a man whose voice had blessed them for decades. Pastor Harris reached toward Elvis. "Would you stand with us?" Elvis nodded. He quietly stepped away from the microphone and joined the circle. No one treated him differently. No one asked for an autograph. At that moment, he wasn't America's biggest entertainer. He was simply another man praying for a friend. Hands joined together, the circle stretched across the front of the church. Pastor Harris began praying. His words weren't polished, they weren't dramatic, they came straight from the heart.
Lord,
we don't understand why tonight unfolded this way. We planned songs. You planned something greater. We ask you now, place your healing hand upon Isaiah. If it is your will, restore his strength. But even if his voice never returns, let him know that his life has already sung louder than any hymn. Around the circle, quiet sobs filled the sanctuary. One by one, people whispered their own prayers. Some prayed aloud, others prayed silently. The sound wasn't organized, it wasn't beautiful in the musical sense, yet somehow it became the most beautiful moment of the evening. Several minutes passed. No one wanted to leave. Then Margaret noticed something. The old silver microphone still stood alone beneath the cross. Isaiah's microphone. She slowly walked toward it. For years, only one person had ever used it during the homecoming service. Tonight, it seemed almost symbolic. She gently removed it from its stand, holding it carefully with both hands. She turned toward Elvis. Everyone watched. Margaret smiled through tears. This microphone doesn't belong to a singer. It belongs to a servant. She paused. For years we thought Isaiah's greatest gift was his voice. She looked around the sanctuary. Tonight we learned it was his humility. She extended the microphone toward Elvis. He gently shook his head. No. The room grew quiet again. Margaret looked confused. Why? Elvis smiled. Because it still belongs to Isaiah. She looked at the microphone again, then back at him. What if he never sings again? Elvis's answer came without hesitation. Then someone else will stand here. But it should never become mine. This church already has enough heroes. It doesn't need another celebrity. The words settled deeply into every heart. Just then, the sanctuary doors slowly opened. Everyone turned. A middle-aged nurse stepped inside wearing her white uniform. Several people recognized her immediately. She worked at the local hospital. She looked exhausted, as though she had hurried directly from work. Pastor Harris walked toward her. Sarah, what happened? She smiled softly. I had to come. She looked toward the congregation. I was with Isaiah. Every eye filled with anticipation. She continued. When he regained consciousness, the first thing he asked wasn't about himself. Several choir members leaned forward. He asked, "Did the church cancel the service?" Margaret covered her mouth. Sarah smiled. I told him, "No." The church kept singing. A tear rolled down the nurse's cheek. He smiled. Then he whispered, "Thank God." The congregation quietly wept. But Sarah wasn't finished. He also asked me to tell everyone something. She unfolded a small piece of paper from her pocket. I wrote it down before leaving. The church became completely silent. She read slowly, "If my voice has ended tonight, don't mourn it. A hymn was never meant to belong to one person. If another heart is willing to sing, let heaven hear it." By the time she finished reading, there wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. Margaret held the microphone against her chest. She realized Isaiah had been teaching them one final lesson all along. A ministry survives, not because one person is gifted, but because everyone is willing. Pastor Harris looked toward Elvis. "I think our brother has already preached tonight." Elvis smiled modestly. "I think he has." The pastor chuckled softly. "So have you." Elvis looked surprised. "I didn't preach." "No," Pastor Harris replied. "You reminded us what worship looks like." Nearly an hour later, the sanctuary slowly emptied. Families embraced one another. People who had entered burdened with sorrow now left carrying quiet hope. Miss Clara walked outside holding the hand of the woman beside her. Daniel carried his suitcase back to the car, only to place it in the trunk before driving home with his wife. Young Michael asked his mother if they could visit Isaiah in the hospital the following week. She smiled through tears. "I think he'd like that." The choir remained behind to clean the sanctuary. For the first time all evening, they laughed together, not because the pain was gone, because hope had returned. Elvis quietly slipped out through the side entrance, exactly as he had planned before any of this happened. No reporters waited outside, no photographers followed him. The parking lot was almost empty. The evening air carried the gentle scent of magnolia trees. As he reached his old Cadillac, someone called out, "Elvis!" He turned. It was Pastor Harris. The elderly minister walked slowly across the parking lot. In his hands, he carried a small, worn Bible. The leather cover was faded. Its corners had softened with age. "I've had this Bible for 40 years, the pastor smiled. "It belonged to my father." Elvis immediately shook his head. "I can't accept that." Pastor Harris laughed gently. "I'm not giving it to Elvis Presley." He stepped closer. "I'm giving it to the little boy who remembered where he learned to sing." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Elvis accepted the Bible with both hands. He held it carefully, almost reverently. "I don't deserve this." Pastor Harris placed a hand on his shoulder. "None of us deserve grace. That's why it's called grace." 3 months later, the church held another homecoming service. Every pew was filled again. This time, Isaiah Brooks slowly walked onto the platform. The congregation immediately rose to its feet, not because he was completely healed. His voice was weaker now. The doctors had been right. He would never sing with the same strength again. But when Isaiah reached the microphone, he smiled. Then he stepped aside. Instead of singing alone, he invited the entire choir to sing the opening verse with him. No spotlight, no featured solo, just one united choir. Margaret looked toward the front pew. There, unnoticed by almost everyone, sat Elvis once again. This time there was no surprise, no dramatic moment, no microphone waiting. He simply sang along with everyone else, exactly where he wanted to be. Another voice among many, and perhaps that was the greatest song he ever gave.